Hi folks, today we're going to discuss the use of temporal difference learning to model addiction. The views expressed in this presentation are my own. This discussion will rely upon the text titled Reinforcement Learning and Introduction by Richard Sutton and A. Bartow. In this discussion, we're going to cover the Rescorla-Wagner Model of Conditioning, temporal difference learning algorithms as a complex example of the RW model, reward prediction error hypothesis, and dopamine neuron activity explained via TD learning, and finally we'll look at addiction and TD learning. Surprise in its role in learning. What happens when you're surprised? One explanation is that surprise upends what learners believe and help them to make discoveries, giving strong opportunities for independent learning. A more clinical explanation, and one that is the core idea of the Rescorla-Wagner model, is that animals only learn where events violate their expectations. In other words, where the animal is surprised. Surprise then can be understood as the difference between an expected outcome and an actual outcome. Throughout this presentation, we're going to see how the concept of surprise is used in learning, with marketing as an example, machine learning, and then finally addiction. Surprise in learning and marketing messages. Imagine the first time you receive a marketing message via a phone. You may be surprised, and it may cause you to rethink how messages and text messages are used. After such a discovery, messages are now either personal to you or marketing related, whereas previously you thought they were only personal in nature. A message can generally be thought of as a conditional stimulus, whereas the act of reading a message is a conditional response. These concepts of conditional stimulus and conditional response will be used in the next few slides. What is the role of blocking and surprise? Blocking occurs when an animal fails to learn a conditioned response when a potential conditional stimulus is presented with another conditional stimulus that had been previously used to condition the animal to produce that conditioned response. That's a mouthful, so let me explain. Basically, one conditional stimulus can be blocked by another conditional stimulus. So for example, for a conditional stimulus in the form of a marketing message to be successful in facilitating a conditional response, such as reading the message, one may need to overcome blocking by another conditional stimulus, such as a prior marketing message. Surprise is the mechanism to facilitate unblocking. Surprise and unblocking. Imagine that you don't read messages, a conditional response, from unknown phone numbers, a conditional stimulus, such that all messages from unknown numbers are blocked. As a marketer, you'll need to unblock the conditional stimulus to facilitate the desired conditional response of reading the message. So one possible solution to unblock is that you send a message with a phone number having, for example, the area code 206, where the unknown local 206 number has a lesser probability of being blocked and may result in the desired conditional response of reading the message. So lesser probability, as some phone numbers having 206 area codes have messages that one would want to see, for example, messages from friends and family. So what are some takeaways from these concepts of surprise and blocking in the marketing context? So one takeaway is that you have to constantly use surprise to unblock prior conditional stimulus to facilitate further conditional responses, such as reading a message. And really, this is an ever-increasing cycle of blocking and surprises to overcome blocking. So one algorithmic representation of surprise and blocking is provided on this slide. Let me break this down for you a little bit. So in this algorithm, A and X are two conditional stimulus, such as an unknown number and an unknown local number, such as 206. Y is a limit in the form of an anticipated conditional stimulus, such as, for example, an unknown number. VAX is really a comparative strength between the conditional stimulus A and X, such that a change in one may dominate the other. And then AABY and AXBY are really controls that control the extent to which basically VA and VX are updated. It's effectively like a weight. And then finally, where VAX exceeds RY, this really is just an error value and it is akin to a surprise. And it's a value that's generated and then used to update VAX. And to unblock effectively VA or VAX, depending on which of those A or X dominates the other. The algorithm on the prior slide basically depicted surprise and unblocking within the context of discrete and trial bases. But discrete and trial bases is not really representative of human experience, because human experience is based upon a series of continuous as opposed to discrete states, where past outcomes, or states, give rise to expected future states that can be at odds with actual states, thus creating a surprise that is the basis for learning. So for example, the conditioned response of reading a marketing message could be based upon a plurality of conditional stimulus, such as whether the number is unknown, whether it's a non-US number, whether the number is restricted, emergency number, etc. So human experience is much more multifaceted in terms of states than one that is based upon discrete states and trial bases. So to capture the continuous nature of human experience in states, a new model has to be learned. And this model is known as Temporal Difference Learning, or TD learning. And it's a model for surprise, unblocking, and learning. Let me explain. So TD learning is really a backwards learning strategy, where, for example, a conditional stimulus, such as prior experiences with phone number types, and we'll call that N, makes predictions about the possibility of conditional responses in the form of whether to look at a message or not. And so the way this works is that there's a weighted average that's maintained, which we'll call Z sub t, that's used to determine whether a past number type are eligible for updating in terms of relevance for future predictions. And that the difference between the predicted conditional response and the actual conditional response is referred to as an error value, which is a measure of surprise. Shown on this slide is an algorithm for determining whether or not the updating of prior states needs to occur based upon the existence of surprise. So let me break this down for you a little bit. This algorithm finds the difference between the current and future states, discounts the future, and adds an anticipated reward value. If the error value is high, it means that there's a surprise and some prior states need to be updated. If the error value is low, then there's no surprise and there's no updating of prior states. The updating of prior states or earlier states shifts the predictive strength to more recent states, meaning that more recent states are given greater weight in determining or predicting a particular outcome. So what are the parallels between TD learning and dopamine neuron activity? Well, first, you have to understand the concept of the reward prediction error hypothesis of dopamine neuron activity. So basically, this is a hypothesis that says that phasic response of dopamine neurons only occur when a rewarding event is unpredicted or whether surprise. Dopamine is a neural transmitter used to facilitate motivation, learning, action selection, and figures prominently in addiction, schizophrenia, and Parkinson's. And phasic response is the actual release of dopamine. And we'll get into phasic response in more detail in the next few slides. And finally, in the Sutton text, they cite 5 parallels between TD learning and dopamine neuron activity, but there are some differences. So one parallel between TD learning and dopamine neuroactivity is cited in the following passage. Early in learning, neural cues, that is states, that precede a reward do not cause substantial phasic dopamine response, but with continued learning, these cues gain predictive value and come to elicit phasic dopamine responses. So the takeaway here really is that prior neural states are reinforced as predictors with phasic response. Another parallel between TD learning and dopamine neuroactivity is contained in the following passage. If an even earlier cue reliably precedes a cue that has already acquired a predictive value, the phasic dopamine response shifts to the earlier cue, ceasing for the latter cue. So the takeaway here really is that, for example, an unknown number may be reinforced, learned because part of the sequence that gives rise to the phasic dopamine response. So basically, earlier cues can be predictive, basically, of later cues and states, and that those earlier cues can be reinforced. This is one way in which, basically, the dopamine neuron activity theory is a bit different than just TD learning, in that earlier cues are given precedent, in some cases, over later cues. Another parallel is contained in the passage that after learning, the predictive reward event is omitted. A dopamine neuron's response decreases below its baseline level, shortly after the expected time of the rewarding event. So the takeaway here is that the ZT value, which is this moving average value in TD learning, is really, in a sense, the baseline value. And the expectation of reward itself is reinforcing as opposed to the actual reward. So in other words, it's the expectation of a reward in the form of dopamine, not the actual delivery of dopamine itself, that's reinforcing. So what's the relationship between TD learning and addiction? Well, in addiction, the dopamine surge is assumed to increase the TD error value in a way that cannot be canceled out by changes in the value function. The takeaway here is that the error value overwhelms the ZT value, or the moving average value, that tracks whether a state is eligible for updating or not. So a further point about the relationship between TD learning and addiction is that drug rewards cannot be predicted away, meaning the model does not prevent this by preventing the error value from ever becoming negative when the reward signal is due to an addictive drug. So put another way, there's an elimination of the error correcting feature of TD learning for states associated with administration of drugs, such that a new ZT value cannot be established. Or put another way, when drugs are used, a new baseline for this moving average cannot be established, and the error value is always positive. Summing it up, an animal only learns where events violate its expectations. And in other words, when the animal is surprised. This is the core idea of the Rescorla-Wagner model. Surprise is understood as the difference between an expected outcome and an actual outcome. Conditional stimulus that result in a conditioned response, so for example, looking at a text message, can block pre-existing conditional stimulus that result in the same conditioned response. And surprise can be used to unblock the conditional stimulus such that there is a resulting conditioned response. Surprise can be represented algorithmically as an error value representing the difference between an expected state and an actual state. Where there is a positive error value, prior states may be updated as part of a temporal difference learning model. TD learning, or temporal difference learning, can also be used to describe the reward prediction error hypothesis of dopamine neuron activity and ultimately how addiction works. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.